All right. Well, thank you for that introduction, Wayne. And as you mentioned, I'm an agronomist with the Institute and been working on these economic assessments projects. And Wayne, one of the my roles with the organization is this project that's been supported and funded by Cargill. So we're very grateful for that. And in that role, I've been working with the Cargill's leadership team to identify farmers participants for these interviews. And it's been my pleasure of conducting these interviews with my colleague Archie Flanders. And we're targeted 100 interviews, and we've completed 89 of those interviews. We'll be wrapping up and closing the book on those interviews here in the next couple of weeks in Michigan. So it's been just a real enjoyable experience for both Archie and I, and it's my distinct pleasure today to introduce 3 of those farmers to you. And we've asked them to share a little bit of their experiences in their journey in adopting these soil health practices. I think what you'll find as you listen to them, that we've picked this group of farmers that we've talked to, they're just outstanding role models. They've not only been very successful in adopting these practices on their own farms, but they've also had some great leadership roles, not only locally, but across the country and even internationally, in mentoring other farmers in adopting these practices. So the order of business here is what we'll do is, as you can see on the screen there, you can see the names and pictures of the 3 farmers that we plan to interview, and we'll go in that order. And so what I've asked each of the panelists to do is we'll use about 8 or 9 minutes for each grower to talk about their experiences. Then we'll move on to the next one, and if there's any time left over at the end, we'll try to answer some questions during the Q&A. So, and it's my pleasure to introduce Ms. Lisa Lutz as our first panelist. And Lisa and her husband Jim farm in northeastern Nebraska. They have 3 children and 2 grandchildren. Their 3rd generation farm consists of dryland, corn, soybean rotation, and they've grown alfalfa and they've raised livestock in the past. And so, Lisa, I've kind of given a little bit of introduction there for you. Is there anything I've missed in terms of anything about the farm, the overall characteristics of the farm that you want to share with our audience?
No, I would like to say hi to everybody, and I would like to add that my husband and I have been farming for 30 years, and right now we're corn soybean rotation, but we've raised alfalfa in the past, and we have about 400 acres of both, and we're complete constantly corn soybean rotation. And I grew up on a family farm, and how we farm today is a lot different than how we farmed 40 or 50 years ago.
Thank you, Lisa. So the next question for you is, so what soil health practices have you adopted in your operation, and how long have you been using these practices?
So we've been no-tilling for about 25 years. We started out with a no-till drill, and we've used chicken manure, and we have experimented with cover crops, but haven't quite found a fit for them on our farm. In northeast Nebraska, we depend completely on water, and so sometimes trying to seed them in the fall has been a challenge. And if you use a drill in the fall to seed them, then it breaks up your residue, which is counterproductive from what we're trying to do. So we're very proud of the no-till soil that we have, and continue to do that.
Great, thanks, Lisa. So the next question here that I have for you is, what agronomic and economic benefits have you seen from using these practices?
So there's been several, and we farm in the hills in northeast Nebraska, and so we always say we have 9 acres of flat land and everything else is a hill. And one of the main things we've seen is if you take a yield map today and looked at that, you could not pick out the hills on our fields. The yields have been consistent, going up and down the hills and in the bottoms. And so that means we've had less erosion, better water retention, because water is very important. And then, less fuel, less labor, all of those things that go with that. And, but the consistency and the yield on all of our fields has been, and then just the less nitrogen and less other inputs we've used.
Great, those are great answers. The questions there, Lisa. So what challenges have you faced in implementing these practices? Things like looks like maybe we might have lost Lisa.
Well, John, they
Yep.
told me to shut my
Okay.
turn my video off.
Okay.
So
We should mention Lisa just texted me and she said their electricity went out, so she's having some technical challenges of your own, right, Lisa?
correct.
Well, we can proceed without video. So
Okay.
anyway, back to this question here is what sort of challenges have you faced in implementing these practices? Have you, like, in terms of the planters that you use in your operation, things like cover crop seeding, methods of planting cover crops, the planting depth, a whole bunch of these things. Just what are some of the, maybe if you just highlight for us some of the challenges you've had in adopting these practices?
Okay. Well, my husband is the manager of the team here, and so I can just go by the things that he talks about. And you know, when he talks about starting no-till, one of the first steps is to spread the combine residue evenly. Because if you don't do that, that creates all kinds of planting issues in the spring. And we, like I said, we started with a no-till drill, and now we have a split row planter, and he uses row cleaners. But on our hills and with the precipitation we have, he likes to make the comment that we cannot have enough residue, especially with the corn soybean rotation. So if you have your residue spread, planting goes a lot easier. And then the first few years, you need to use more fertilizer, and then water, hemp, and weed control seems to be a problem, just because I think it's a problem for everyone. And in no-till systems, sometimes you don't have as much weed pressure just because you're not disturbing the soil. So I think I think he does a great job at doing that.
Great. So maybe one final question here for you is, what sort of advice would you have for growers that are starting these practices brand new, and how do they slowly engage in these adoption of these practices?
Well, there's lots of resources out there today, and in the past, when we started, there wasn't those resources out there. And you need to do what works for you. Every person's farm is different, so you need to do what works for you, and you have to do. You know, the first 2 to 3 years are tough, and you have to stick with it. You can't just do it 1 year and give up. And you have to remember how the field looks does not equal yield, and starting with a smooth field helps too. So those are all things to consider.
Great, Lisa. Those are some great comments about your journey around soil health practices. So I guess what we'll do now is we'll switch over to Matt Griggs. So Lisa, if I can get you to mute yourself, and Matt, if you can turn on your video and unmute yourself, we'll introduce you here. So, I would also just encourage everybody to read through these folks' bios, because they have some pretty impressive credentials, and so take a look at them at your convenience. I'll try to highlight the high points of these folks, but again, they're very accomplished in their business life. So our next speaker again is Matt Griggs. Matt is the 5th generation farmer and owner of Griggs Farm LLC in Humboldt, Tennessee. Griggs Farm began operating in 1982, and they currently grow 2,000 acres of cotton, corn, soybeans, and wheat. And like I said, Matt has a lot of things on his list of accomplishments, but maybe one of the most noticeable accomplishments is that he's served as a speaker at the 2018 National No-Till Conference, and probably even more notable is Griggs Farms was featured in the 2019 8-part docuseries on the History Channel called The American Farm. So Matt, that's an introduction for you, and if I've missed anything, maybe just share a little bit more about the general characteristics of your farm, and then we'll kind of go back and forth on the Q&A thing again.
I'm glad to be here, and I appreciate the invite. One correction, we began operations at our location in 1882, not 1982. So,
okay. You're right on that.
Personally, I took over the farm from my dad in 2005. He passed away suddenly in the middle of the season, and I was 4 years out of college and had to take over the farm then. And currently this year we grow a mixture of corn, cotton, soybeans, and wheat on about 2,000 acres.
Okay, thanks, Matt. So what kind of soil health practices have you adopted on your farm, and how long have you been using these practices? So if you could give
We've
us
been
a
using terracing for decades. We've been doing no-till for about 22 to 23 years or so. But the one thing that I noticed after taking over the farm a few years later was we just weren't seeing the improvements in the soil with no-till and terracing. Basically, we were maintaining the status quo, but we weren't actually improving anything. And at that time, we really took a look into ways to increase the organic matter of our soils to build them up. We use manure and cover crops to accomplish that.
Mm-hmm. So what sort of agronomic and economic benefits have you seen from these practices?
We started experimenting with cover crops in 2010. We actually started planting them large scale in 2014. And in 2015, we started planting everything green into high biomass cover crops. But over the last 5 years, we've seen our organic matter close to double. It's really increased the water infiltration ability of our soils, our water holding capacities. We've seen the standard water infiltration rate on our soils and no-till is about 2 inches per hour. We've documented upwards of 60 inches per hour infiltration rate behind cover crops for the first inch, and then for the second inch, we've documented up to 12 inches per hour infiltration rate. The most immediate improvement we've seen is probably in weed control. Palmer amaranth pigweed is a tremendous problem in our area, and we're quickly running out of herbicide options to control it. And cover crops has been the best cultural practice that we can use to help us control these weeds. We've also been able to reduce our fertilizer some, especially in cotton. In corn, our testing has shown that we still have problems with nitrogen types, so we haven't really been able to decrease our nitrogen use in corn. But on cotton, we've been able to cut our nitrogen use in about half and maintain the same yield. So it's really in cotton where we've experienced the most problems implementing cover crops, but it's also where we've seen the most rewards whenever we're able to do it. Whenever we're able to do it successfully.
Great. And so Matt, you mentioned those challenges and you shared those during the interview a little bit. So could you kind of detail some of those challenges a little bit more for us?
The biggest challenge we've experienced utilizing high biomass cover crops has been at planting time, and not necessarily so much in corn and soybeans, because we're not quite dealing with as much biomass when we're planting those crops, and it's also those crops are also planted deeper too. But cotton is a very shallow planted crop. It doesn't have much bigger to get up out of the ground. And then when you're dealing with a thick mat of residue in cover crops that you have to cut through and accurately place the seed, it's really been difficult at times. And we've had to come up with some unique ways to modify our equipment in order to be able to do it successfully. And over the last 2 or 3 years, I feel like we've really solved the riddle on being able to plant successfully into high biomass cover crops.
And maybe that highlights the point, a good point to make here is that you, even in spite of the challenges, you stuck with it and persevered, and that maybe there's a moral to the story there around perseverance.
Well, we found out that farming out of a jug is not going to be sustainable long term. Nature's going to find a way to get by all these chemical means that we've come up with, and we've got to depend on the tools that the good Lord gave us in order to farm successfully, and that's going to include a lot of cultural practices, and sticking our heads in the sand and thinking the scientists are going to come up with a way to combat a lot of these weeds in the next few years is not realistic. We've got to take it on ourselves to try and stay out in front of the problems of these resistant weeds in order to be able to farm long term.
Yeah. So maybe one final comment from you is what sort of advice would you have for folks that are starting these practices anew, if you will?
There's probably several things we've learned. One thing is to start small. If you've never planted into cover crops before or planted green, I'd say just leave a sprayer width wide in your field and let it grow up, and then try to plant into it and see what it does. It probably won't be a success, but if you look at it closely and examine what went right and what went wrong, and maybe be able to come up with ways on your farm to be able to mitigate the problems. Also, do a lot of testing. Don't depend on other entities, other companies to do the testing for you. Test these things on your field and replicate it in replicated plots and figure out what exactly works for you on your farm. We do a lot of testing on our farm every year, because we found out what works on other people's farms won't necessarily work on our farm, and vice versa. So doing a lot of testing and experimentation, trying crazy ideas, all that kind of stuff is, we've learned of what really works on our farm and what doesn't work, and it's allowed us to be successful.
Some great points there, and we really appreciate, Matt, you sharing your experiences with the audience here around your journey of soil health management systems. So I think what we'll do is we'll move on to our final panelists here. And Matt, and Mark, have you brought on your video and unmuted yourself? Oh, there we go. There's Mark. So our next speaker then is Mark Jackson. Mark Jackson is a fifth-generation grain and livestock farmer in southeastern Iowa with more than 4 decades of experience farming. Conservation is a cornerstone of his farming philosophy, and he has several accomplishments and achievements and awards on his list. If you read through his bio again, so I'm just going to ask you to take a look at that bio, but I'll just mention that just this year he received the I'm just looking at the email he sent me here this morning, Iowa Conservation Farmer of the Year Award 2020, and it's sponsored by Farm Bureau, Iowa Department of Ag, and John Deere. So Mark, if I've missed anything in terms of your farm operation, go ahead and fill in the details there.
No, thank you, John, very much. I appreciate the opportunity to be here today. I guess not unlike the previous 2 panelists, I too am a family farmer. My son is 6th generation. We have land that is parceled land that dates back to 1890. So that's a legacy that always, it drives that legacy of the next generation, making it better, that sort of thing. And sustainability has always been something that this farm has used as their guiding cornerstone for moving forward in that continuous improvement model. So we do corn and soybeans. So I'm not kind of halfway in between, you might say, where Lisa and where Matt are located, kind of across the 900-mile stretch, if you will, across the Midwest at an angle. I do corn and soybeans. We do cereal rye. I've been doing cereal rye, no-till, corn and soy, but the cereal rye has been a scenario I've been doing since about 2012. And I think when we use a lot of livestock manure, we have a swine finishing operation here as well, which has allowed the expansion of our farm through the next generation.
So you touched on it a little bit, but Mark, would you review for us the soil health practices that you've adopted and how long you've been using these practices in your operation?
Yeah, exactly. So from those regenerative, I like to call them regenerative health practices, where we use cereal rye in addition to our no-till practices. I began no-tilling in about 1985, and that was an economic driver during the Great Depression, when a lot of farming lifestyles changed. It's a cultural mindset to get involved in this, the no-till and the cereal rice scenario, but we've adapted quite well. Machinery come along sometime in the 90s, along with the chemical access, so we can do no-till soybeans and the corn stalks. So we've been doing that for going on close to 25 years now. So I think our goals there were actually, erosion control, nutrient banking, and increasing our organic matter. And soil health wasn't actually discussed back then as we do today. So I think that's great that we can create that. But I think it's all about the basics. I use waterways, headlands, grass headlands, buffers. My manure management plans come in on a regular basis, where, 4-year cycle. every acre is retested so that we can maintain, not over apply. Because water quality at the end of the day is just as important as soil health, as several of your speakers talked about earlier on. So I think that soil stewardship is just a good cross section.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's a good cross section.
Yeah. So in terms of agronomic and economic benefits that you've seen from these practices, can you kind of highlight those for us?
Well, from an agronomic standpoint, I think it was discussed earlier, 3 to 5 years is a good goal when you're working with your, starting your no-till, starting your cereal rye, when you're working on that health soil improvement. And no one has said anything that I am going to say now. I think it's been covered, but you know, we have that reduced soil crusting criteria when we increase our residue on surface with greater water infiltration, less soil erosion. You know, the soil biology, you know, you can see the earthworms rather quickly come back. Obviously, it's the bacteria and those sort of things that you can't see. But we utilize the slake test, an item we use to kind of help, you know, prove that baseline that we are getting better. From an economic perspective, obviously, we're saving time and machinery. We use a lot less horsepower. Dollars saved per acre is just as valuable for the profit margin at the end of the day as it is to increase our yields. And I think that's an attitude we like to utilize with those cover crops. That's, you know, it goes towards reducing the impact of some of those noxious weeds that are everybody's least best friend. And so I think from that perspective, I think it's moving forward.
Mm-hmm. And so, like the other speakers have mentioned, this wasn't all a bed of roses for you. There were some challenges for you, and maybe if you just kind of highlight some of those challenges for us.
Yeah, I think one thing that we haven't talked about in this whole conversation, one of the major challenges I've seen, this is just an anecdata comment, if you will, that the cultural mindset is our biggest hurdle sometimes, getting farmers to change, because we are talking generations deep farmers, and doing what my father did, my grandfather, sometimes it is terribly hard to change that and feel comfortable about doing it. But once you can get past that, obviously, then we can jump into the more basic scenarios, such as machinery, you know, equipment, which is modern now. When I started farming in 1974, you know, open station tractors were the mantra, and everything was plowed, and it was clean cover. So we deal with you know, the cost of the technology, and I utilize a lot of technology, which is very important, I think, to help not only help my mental stress, but it also gives me good baseline data and that sort of information, so we move forward in today's world. But yeah, getting good seed placement is a major hurdle when you're no-tilling, when you're driving into 5-foot tall rye, trying to put a soybean seed that's, you know, 1/4 inch across and place it at a specific depth. When you're driving on nothing more than, you might say, you've thrown all the laundry in the house on your living room floor, and you try to plow through that with your you know, seeder and establish a perfect depth. And that's not unlike what we're dealing with today. So getting that trench closed, not creating a smearing effect, which will cause problems down the road. Access to good GMO seeds. I know that conversation may stir some people's ire, but at the end of the day, we're about reducing pesticide loads on our soil, and through that seed modification, we're able to put a plant out there that resists pests, weeds, and that sort of thing. Much less impact has been a very important element for me to go. So with the stay green elements of a seed, where you're talking corn that has a good variety for dry down, drought resistance, those sort of things. So at the end of the day, we can actually reduce our costs once again.
Okay, so any final parting comments and suggestions and advice you'd give to folks that are starting new at these practices?
Well, I'm only going to be echoing my panel mates here, but yeah, starting slow is definitely something you want to do. Get good education background. Know your risk concerns, because it's more about what's going to happen as to what you don't be thinking about pie in the sky as much as what's the worst case scenario moving forward. With the resources we have moving forward, but seeing that next generation and my ability to show people that I've farming that same acre of ground that my great-grandfather farmed, and I can produce 4 times as much output with less inputs, I think speaks volumes today.
Mm-hmm. Great. Those are some great experiences that you shared with us, Mark. So I'm just looking at the Q&A here. I don't know, maybe someone might have to help me here. Are these questions intended for our panel? Wayne, do you have a sense?
Yes. The,
okay.
The top one, you see it with 5 votes there?
But how many? But 5, yeah. Yeah, so one of the questions here, and I don't know who wants to answer this question, but whoever feels compelled, when I'll read it off, and whoever wants to chime in can do that. We just heard about the importance of economics in promoting soil health management. For any and all the farmers, how much are you motivated to enhance soil health by economics and how much by other factors? Mark, you're unmuted, so maybe you can start off.
Economics is definitely right at the top of that scenario. I mean, if you can save $40 to $80 right up front by reducing machinery costs per acre, I think rather quickly you can see you can actually offset that concern about yield drag right up front. So yeah, definitely.
Do we have any other comments from any other panelists? Matt?
John, this is...
I'll answer that question too. I'm driven primarily by agronomic considerations. I'm a lot stronger than that in that area and more so than in business. But we do spend a lot of time trying to put a pencil to paper and figure out the actual financial benefits or the cost to utilizing our soil health practices. But it's really hard because there's so many variables to consider to actually be able to nail it down.
Lisa, did you have any? Thanks for that, Matt. Lisa, you have any comment?
Well, I guess I just wanted to say, I think, when we started because of the soil erosion and to keep soil in its place and for conserving water. And then, then it led into the economics and making, the economics were positive. And so that helped us move forward with that.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
And if I may add, one more comment would be to remind everyone sustainability. It's not about the economics, because at the end of the day, we still have to focus a balanced conversation with the environment and our social element in that conversation, which was, I think, very well laid out earlier by Sean McMahon.
Yep. I guess we have time for maybe one more question. And the next one I see here, I'll just try to capture what growers need to aggregate their problems and pose them to scientists. We may not know about them. So it sounds like maybe there's some folks in the scientific community that aren't always aware of the challenges you have. So I don't know if if you need to respond to that, but that's a question that if anybody has a comment there, wife.
I think technology allows that data transfer a little more seamlessly once we get through the conversation of sharing that data. But I think it's definitely, sometimes you have to share your data to see the bigger problems from afar, whereas sometimes I'm too close to the forest to see the trees.
Right.
And John, to that, I would like to add, sometimes in the research world, they look at one thing or maybe two, and, taking a whole systems approach is kind of hard, especially when it comes to soil health and some other things. But that systems approach is what's important.
Yes. Thank you. There's one more question I think you guys might be interested in responding to, and that's, do you think resistance to GMOs will reduce as pressures on the food chain increase and prices rise? Many crops such as bananas may not have any future without GMOs. Mark, you kind of talked about that a little bit earlier. Maybe you want to start off there.
Right. Yeah. So I think there again, there's that comprehensive working together with our seed providers, our legislators. That's where our commodity groups have worked wonders to help educate. Knowing and doing sometimes are the hardest part. Sometimes the biggest hurdle for those that want it the most. So as we move forward and the pipelines have changed, we've got elements involved internationally where now you can maybe work with China a little better when China, for example, owns part of the seed driving suppliers, and we're down to only 3 or 4 major suppliers today. So a lot of these things, it's a smaller circle, so maybe it's an element where you can work very much closer together to solve the problem.
Great. Thank you, Mark. Anybody else? Matt, Lisa, any comments there?
I would like to think that the pressure on GMOs would reduce, especially if the food supply does become tighter. But I think we're facing a lot of external forces, especially in the media, that propagates a lot of left-wing opinions that aren't always necessarily true. So I mean, I think we're fighting an uphill battle on it.
Mm-hmm. Lisa, any thoughts, sir?
No, I just want to say that, I mean, the whole GMO conversation will change as the Arctic apple and other things are, you know, the GMO technology will help, that will benefit the consumer because, and I think that'll be an important part of the conversation.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think I really appreciate the responses you all have given to these questions. And I think we probably better close here at this point in time. We've used up our time, and I'll just remind everybody that we've got a break now and we'll be resuming here at 3:05. But I'd again just like to thank Mark and Lisa and Matt for taking the time out of their day to visit with us. Matt interrupted his vacation, so we appreciate you doing that, Matt. So anyway, you all have a good summer and best wishes on the upcoming growing season. We appreciate it.
Thank you.